Imagine a scenario where your people are constantly being attacked, their crops destroyed, their animals stolen, and their hope buried under fear. Now imagine that, in the midst of this chaos, you are hiding, trying to save what little is left, crushing wheat in silence so as not to be seen by enemies. And then, in the middle of this almost apocalyptic scene, someone appears, a stranger who looks into your eyes and says, "The Lord is with you, valiant warrior." But you know that can't be right, because you're not a warrior. You can barely face your own fears. This is the story of Gideon, a man who began his journey by hiding, doubting, questioning, but who ended up becoming the deliverer of an entire nation. The most curious? He is the only biblical leader who has asked for 2 consecutive supernatural confirmations from God before acting. Ever wondered why God would choose such a person, insecure, doubtful, and seemingly unprepared? The answer is simple and powerful, because God's strength is made perfect in human weakness. Gideon was not chosen in spite of his frailty, but because of it. God wanted to show, not only to Israel, but to all who came after, that true power is not in the size of the army, in social position, or in natural talent, but in obedience and trust in the Lord. Have you ever felt too small to achieve something great? Gideon teaches us that it is not our limitations that define our destiny, but our willingness to trust God. If you identified with Gideon's journey, share in the comments how you have learned to trust God in the midst of your own struggles. Let's explore more together about how God can turn our weaknesses into strength. According to scholars, Israel lived under Midianite oppression for about 7 consecutive years before divine intervention through Gideon. These invaders plundered crops, destroyed resources, and left the population in a constant state of starvation and humiliation. The Bible text describes the Israelites hiding in caves in the mountains, a vivid portrait of a people completely cornered. And it was at that very moment, when all seemed lost, that God acted. Gideon, who belonged to the tribe of Manasseh, one of the least militarily expressive, still saw himself as the smallest in his father's house. In human logic, he would be the last option to lead any kind of rebellion, let alone a war campaign against an immensely superior army. But this is precisely where the narrative becomes powerful. God does not call the able, he empowers those he calls. This story isn't just about a man from the past. It's about you, about me, about anyone who has ever felt insufficient. It is an invitation to reflect on how we deal with our insecurities and on what God can do through those who least expect it. And in the end, maybe the real question isn't whether you're strong enough to win, but whether you're willing to trust even when everything around you says it's impossible. Gideon was at rock bottom, literally. The fear and oppression of the Midianites had led the Israelites to hide in the mountains, away from the eyes of the invaders, while their possessions were stolen year after year. In this atmosphere of despair and frustration, something extraordinary happened. Just as he was performing a simple but dangerous task, threshing wheat in a winepress, a process normally done outdoors, Gideon was surprised by an unexpected visitor. It was then that the angel of the Lord appeared to him and made a statement that, at first glance, seemed like a mistaken identity. "The Lord is with you, mighty man." But how could this be true? Gideon, who saw himself as the smallest and weakest in his household, could hardly understand how anyone could call him valiant. He questioned the angel. "If the Lord is with us, why do all these things happen to us? Where are the wonders that our fathers told us?" This doubt was not a simple resistance to the call, but an expression of a deep questioning about the presence of God in the suffering of his people. Gideon was aware of the difficulties of his generation, and his questions were, in a way, a reflection of a time when hope seemed distant. However, God's response was simple but powerful. "Go with the strength you have, and deliver Israel out of the hand of the Midianites. Do I not send you?" Judges 6:14. What seemed to be an impossible task was reduced to a clear and straightforward order. God wasn't asking Gideon to be strong. He was asking for obedience. The Lord was not interested in Gideon's weaknesses, but rather in his willingness to act even in the face of limitations. Gideon's strength, like that of all great leaders in history, was not in his personal ability, but in his willingness to trust God. At this point, Gideon began to doubt even more. How could such a simple and vulnerable man be able to do something so grandiose? He asked for a sign. If it is really the Lord who sends me, give me a proof. Gideon prepared an offering and placed it on a stone, hoping that somehow the Lord would confirm the authenticity of the call. The signal came when the angel touched the offering with a staff, and fire arose from the stone and consumed the sacrifice. It was a visible and undeniable miracle that made Gideon fear for his life, but it also filled him with certainty that he was facing something divine and profound. But the Lord did not stop there. Next, God asked Gideon to destroy the altar of Baal, an idol that his own father had erected. Idolatry had defiled the hearts of the people of Israel, and this command to destroy the altar was not only an act of faith, but a declaration of allegiance to God, severing any connection with pagan practices. Though still fearful, Gideon obeyed, but at night to avoid the wrath of the citizens. At dawn, when the city found out what had happened, Gideon was confronted with the fury of the people. But it was his father Joash who gave the most startling answer: "If Baal is really a god, let him defend himself." That moment marked a decisive turning point. Gideon's courage began to shine, and from that moment he went from a hidden man with doubts and fears to a leader who would begin to move toward the liberation of his people. Obedience, though incomplete and full of uncertainty, was setting a new path for Israel, and there was still more evidence to be done. God asked Gideon to be even bolder. He asked for one more sign, this time involving the wool of a lamb. Gideon, still unsure, made the request, "Let the dew fall only on the wool and not on the earth." When this happened, Gideon asked again, this time reversing the conditions to ensure that it was not just a coincidence. And when the dew came exactly as he had requested, Gideon knew without a doubt that God was choosing him for something great. These signs were not just temporary miracles. They were moments of building Gideon's faith, necessary steps for him to understand that his strength came from God and that he was not alone in this mission. He would not be an ordinary hero. Their true strength would come from obedience and trust, not from their military skill or resources. If there is a central message in Gideon's trajectory, it is this: true strength is not in quantity, experience, or prestige, but in total dependence on God. What makes this story so remarkable is the way the Lord intentionally deconstructs human logic to reveal a spiritual truth. When we trust less in ourselves and more in Him, that's when we become truly effective. After confirming his calling with two signs, the dew on the wool, Gideon finally mustered up his courage and began assembling an army to confront the Midianites. To the surprise of many, about 32,000 men showed up. It was a respectable number, and although it was still inferior to that of the enemies, it brought a certain comfort. But it was at this point that God began to act unexpectedly. He said something seemingly illogical. "You have too many people." In a war scenario, reducing the number of soldiers seems to be a recipe for failure. But God had a purpose. He wanted Israel's victory to be so impossible in human eyes that no one could say it came from self-effort. The first screening was simple. Everyone who was afraid could return home, and with that, 22,000 left. Only 10,000 remained. Still, God declared, "There are still many." Then he ordered a new test. Gideon led the men to a stream and watched as they drank water. Only those who licked the water with their hands, on alert, were chosen. The result? An army reduced to just 300 men. With this tiny group, God intended to deliver Israel from an enemy force that was as countless as the sand of the sea. Judges 7:12. This moment is essential to understanding a profound concept. God doesn't need numbers, he needs trusting hearts. Divine mathematics is different. Where the world says impossible, God says it's enough. The focus of the story was never the size of the army, but the complete surrender of Gideon's heart to the divine will. God's decision to use only 300 men has spiritual implications. It represents the abandonment of self-sufficiency and total trust in divine direction. This is where many people fail, when seeking security in resources, titles, or human support. God wanted Israel to learn, and for us to learn, that faith is more powerful than brute force, and that obedience can open paths where logic cannot. Gideon, now strengthened by the assurance that God was in control, did not hesitate. Even with a small number, he knew he wouldn't fight alone. This conviction is what separates believers from those who only observe. Active faith is that which moves even in the face of the impossible. At this point, Gideon's story becomes more than a military account. It becomes a metaphor for the spiritual life. How many times do we feel incapable, with limited resources or without support? How many times do we find ourselves facing giant situations with small tools? Gideon's response to all this was trust. He could have fled, but he decided to move on, even without human guarantees. This part of the journey shows that God values availability over ability. The Lord is not impressed by outward strength, but by hearts willing to obey even when everything seems unfavorable. Gideon teaches us that in God's hands, even the most obvious weaknesses can become powerful weapons. The moment of truth has arrived. The enemy army encamped in the valley like a dark cloud that covered the land. There were thousands, armed, experienced, organized men. In contrast, Gideon had only 300 soldiers, an almost symbolic number in the face of the oppressive force of the Midianites. Any general in the face of this would back down. But Gideon had something that his enemies did not have: divine direction. And the battle plan that God gave him did not involve spears or frontal assaults. The strategy was, by human standards, completely absurd. Each man was to carry a trumpet, a lighted torch hidden inside an earthen vessel, and at the agreed signal, everyone was to break the vessels, raise the torches, and blow the trumpets with force. That was it. No weapons, no cavalry charge, only sound, light, and obedience. The moment has come. In the middle of the night, when the enemy army slept in apparent safety, the 300 men spread out in 3 groups around the camp. Gideon raised his arm. The signal has been given. In an instant, the sound of trumpets cut through the silence, torches lit up the darkness, and vessels were shattered, creating an intense and unexpected noise. What happened next was pure confusion. Waking up in panic, the enemy soldiers found themselves surrounded by lights and sounds. Without understanding what was happening, they began to attack each other. The feeling was that they were being invaded by an immense army. Fear spread like wildfire. Before long, what was a cohesive army became a disorganized and defeated group, fighting each other and fleeing in despair. The lesson here is profound. Victory came not from numerical strength or military skill, but from faithfulness to God's direction. What seemed foolish was actually heavenly wisdom. And this is where a powerful spiritual principle emerges. God uses improbable means to bring about extraordinary results. Another notable point is Gideon's posture. At no time does he magnify himself. He leads with firmness, but with humility. He follows God's instructions, even when they seem illogical. And this shows another essential value for any leader: humility to obey, even without understanding. Gideon teaches us that true spiritual leadership is not imposed by force, but is expressed through trust in God, sensitivity to His voice, and the courage to act even when everything seems otherwise. In the end, the battle won with vessels and trumpets was not just a military victory. It was a declaration to the world that when God is in charge, the impossible becomes inevitable. After Gideon's death, Israel found itself at a dangerous crossroads. The man who had delivered the nation from the clutches of the Midianites was no longer with them to guide them. During Gideon's lifetime, Israel enjoyed temporary peace, but true spiritual stability depended on something deeper: steadfast faithfulness to God. When Gideon left, the absence of his leadership and divine vision left the people vulnerable. What followed was a rapid spiritual decay. Since Gideon had rejected the throne and placed the government in God's hands, Israel should have continued to live with this same understanding that God should be the only king. However, the lack of a visible leader was soon reflected in a return to old mistakes. Idolatry, which had never been fully eradicated, has once again infiltrated the lives of the people of Israel. The ephod, that cloak that Gideon had made as a token of gratitude for the victory, became an object of worship. Rather than being a reminder of God's deliverance, ephod came to be worshipped by the Israelites, diverting their worship from the true source of victory. This mistake showed that the memory of God's blessings can be easily corrupted when people do not maintain a true relationship with Him. Idolatry, disguised as legitimate worship, caused the people to fall into spiritually harmful practices. Abimelech, one of Gideon's sons, also entered the scene, and his rise to power further revealed the fragility of Gideon's legacy. Instead of following the example of his father, who had rejected absolute power, Abimelech sought to seize it by force. His desire to rule Israel was not rooted in a commitment to God, but rather in the pursuit of power. He murdered his own brothers, with the exception of one, Jotham, to secure his position as king. This act of betrayal and violence made it clear that even though the people of Israel had been freed from the Midianites, they were still trapped in a deeper chain of sin, a lack of true faithfulness to God. Abimelech not only usurped power, but also used brute force to impose his rule. His reign was marked by violence and mistrust, a direct reflection of the absence of a genuine relationship with God. The people, who had been free, were now in a new form of oppression, no longer from an external enemy, but from a leader who cared only for his own ambition. Abimelech's story is a reminder that when leadership is driven by ego rather than a true dependence on God, the result is always disastrous. Israel, who had been delivered by a lowly man like Gideon, was now under the rule of a tyrant who represented all that Gideon had rejected. The lust for power, betrayal, and lack of faith created a cycle of chaos and desolation. Gideon's story ends with a clear and powerful lesson for all of us. True victory comes from unwavering trust in God, not in our own resources or abilities. Although Gideon began his journey as an insecure and reluctant man, he became a leader who defeated an immense army of only 300 men, showing that when we follow divine instructions, the impossible becomes possible. But Gideon's story isn't just about how he won the battle. It warns us of the dangers that arise when we stop looking to God and begin to seek power, control, or recognition. The ephod that Gideon made with the good intentions of remembering the victory turned into an idol that diverted the hearts of the people. The search for power and the worship of wrong things caused the hard-won peace to disintegrate. After Gideon's death, the nation of Israel quickly fell back into idolatry and the pursuit of power, which eventually brought suffering again. The rise of his son Abimelech is the clearest example of how a lack of faithfulness to God can quickly result in oppression and destruction. Abimelech, who was supposed to be a faith-guided leader, chose to follow the path of violence and betrayal to achieve power. This showed that true leadership comes not from strength, but from obedience to God. What can we learn from the story of Gideon and Abimelech? True greatness is not in accumulating power or wealth, but in living humbly, keeping spiritual principles as the basis of all our actions. When we put our trust in God, He enables us to do the impossible. But when we seek our own glory, we are led to fall. The final lesson is clear. It doesn't matter how much we have achieved or how great our victory is. If we don't keep our focus on God, everything we have achieved can easily be lost. Gideon teaches us that true victory is that which comes from a heart that is faithful to God, not from our own merits, and that our mission is not to accumulate power, but to serve the Lord with obedience and humility. Now, it is up to each of us to reflect on how we have dealt with the victories in our lives. Are we seeking to honor God in all that we do, or are we allowing pride, idolatry, and the pursuit of power to distract our focus? True victory lies in remaining faithful to God, even when the temptations of a powerful world try to lead us away from His purpose. Now that you know Gideon's true victory, ask yourself, am I seeking God's glory or trying to build my own image? If this video has inspired you to reflect on your faith journey, like, share it with friends, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that teach us how to live with purpose and faithfulness. Together, we can learn to walk with greater confidence and humility, like Gideon.